Shalom, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Did You Know? I am your host, Rabbi Ira Brower from Shalom Boca Messianic Synagogue here in Boca Raton, Florida.
And I'm your co-host, Trysten Tice.
So, Trysten, what are we going to talk about today?
I'm very excited. We're talking, and also I have to preface, my voice is gone. I was sick, but it's coming back, and you can still hear me. But we're talking about Daniel 9 timeline, which points directly to Jesus, but we're going to break it down, and I'm going to read it, if that's okay, first.
Yeah.
And then I'd say if you could give the context and explain what's going on.
Sounds good. Let's
Great.
do it.
So picking up Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27. 70 weeks are decreed concerning your people and your holy city, to put an end to transgression, to bring sin to an end, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the Holy of Holies. So know and understand, from the issuing of the decree, to restore and to build Jerusalem until the time Mashiach the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be rebuilt with plaza and moat, but it will be in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, Mashiach will be cut off and have nothing. Can you explain what is Mashiach?
Mashiach is the Hebrew word for Messiah.
Great.
Or anointed one. Literally is what it means.
So, verse 26, then after the 62 weeks, Mashiach, or Messiah, will be cut off and have nothing. Then the people of a prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. But his end will come like a flood. Until the end of the war that is decreed, there will be destruction. Then he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the 1 week, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on a wing of abominations will come one who destroys, until the decreed annihilation is poured out on the one who destroys. Lots there. Can you explain what's going on?
Okay. Well, I think it's really important to understand the setting, the context of what's going on, who's speaking, and so on. So without getting into too much detail, of course, this is from the book of Daniel. Daniel was a Jewish prophet that wrote this book during the time of the exile in Babylon, which took place from 486 to 439, somewhere in there, about 70. It was 70 years. And the chapter starts out with Daniel praying to God, and he's referencing, it says, I, Daniel, understood from the books that according to the word of Adonai, the word of the Lord, to Jeremiah the prophet, of the destruction of Jerusalem would be 70 years. So he's referencing a prophecy from the book of Jeremiah that the Babylonian exile would last 70 years. So it's now coming to the end of that time. And so he goes on from there, and I'm not going to go through the whole prayer, but he's praying and he's pouring out his heart to the Lord, confessing his sin and the sin of the people, the Jewish people who had been exiled to Babylon as a result of their rebellion against God.
Yeah.
That's why they were there. That was the penalty for their sin. That was even prophesied back in the time of Moses, that if they failed to keep the Torah, that this would happen. They would be plucked out of the land and sent off into a foreign land. So that's the context here. And so Daniel, going through this whole prayer of confession and acknowledging God's mercy, God's goodness, even in spite of the consequences that they were suffering. And he's asking for forgiveness and for restoration for the people, essentially. And then it says in verse 20, while I was still speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplications before Adonai, before the Lord my God, on behalf of the holy mountain of my God. So he's praying for himself, confessing his sin, the sin of the people, praying for the people, and for the restoration of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Because don't forget, Jerusalem, up until the time of the exile, the temple represented the very presence of God and the very center of Jewish life of the time. And then he says, verse 21, yet, yes, while I was praying, Gabriel, the one I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me swiftly about the time of the evening offering.
And Gabriel's an angel.
Gabriel is an archangel, high-level angel.
That's crazy. This is awesome. Yeah.
And Gabriel's considered the archangel for Israel, for the Jewish people.
Okay.
So Gabriel comes to him, and then it says, he instructed me and said to me, Daniel, I have come now to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your requests, a message went out, and I have come to declare it to you, for you are greatly esteemed. Therefore, consider the message and understand the vision.
And that's what I just read.
And then he goes on to speak what you read previously.
Okay.
Yeah.
So hopefully that lines up what's going on. And if you haven't read the book of Daniel, Old Testament book, it's really riveting, honestly. It's a great read, and we do encourage you to go and read it for yourself. But the first question I want to ask, so I have a couple questions here that I'm going to be asking you, so you can just help to break down and understand how this points to the Messiah that we believe is Yeshua, that Jesus is the Messiah. That's who this is referencing and pointing to. First question, in verse 25, 9:25, it says, so know and understand from the issuing of the decree to restore and to build Jerusalem until the time Messiah, the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Who gave this decree?
Yeah, so there were 2 decrees that were issued. So again, just a little historical context, Israel was taken into exile by Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, some may be familiar with him. They're in Babylon for 70 weeks. Babylon is the primary empire of the time. Now a new empire comes along by the name Persia. And the emperor of Persia at the time, when they conquered the Babylonians, was Cyrus. And Cyrus then issues a decree allowing the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem. And that was in 457.
Okay.
And then some years after that was the decree that is referenced here, which is Artaxerxes.
Yes, and that was in 457.
And that was in 457.
Yes. Cyrus was the other one, but so there were 2 decrees, but in this passage, it was Artaxerxes that was giving that decree.
Right.
And so the second question then says, what's the significance of the 70 weeks? So it's talking about the 62 weeks, the 70 weeks, this amount of time, and there's a whole timeline. And essentially what we're trying to communicate is that all of these times build up to exactly when Jesus walked the earth, was born, died, resurrected. It gives us the exact timeline of Jesus.
Correct.
And can you explain how that's broken down?
Yeah. So generally speaking, the 70 weeks is each week is 7 years.
Okay.
So it's 490 years total.
Total.
But it's broken up.
Okay.
Okay. So the first part, the 62 weeks, is to the time of Messiah. And then it says, as you read, he will be cut off after the 62 weeks. So this is historical, right? So the decree to rebuild the temple was issued, as we said, at a point in time. And then if you count off 434 years, is the time of Yeshua, time of Jesus.
Right when he came.
When he came, right? And then the 69 weeks, 483 years, is when he's cut off, right? So what does that mean when he's cut off?
That
He'll be crucified. He'll be died. So that means, according to this timeline, he has already come and died. Why is that important? Well, for Jewish people who are still waiting for the Messiah, who have any credence in the scriptures themselves, it's very clear that he will be cut off at the end of 434 years after the decree to rebuild the temple.
Right. And that's exactly what happened.
And that's the timeline of Yeshua.
And so we were looking into it, researching about it. And the Jewish interpretation, just strictly not Messianic Jewish. And again, we're going to do an episode on this, just Messianic Judaism. I think that term isn't understood very well for what that means. We are Jewish believers in Jesus, that he is the Messiah. Again, we're reading this, it's Old Testament, but we recognize that Jesus is the Messiah. All of these scriptures point to him. He was in the beginning, through it all, and in the New Testament when we have that now. But so that's what it is. But so the Jewish perspective of reading this, it says that it's often seen as symbolic of Israel's restoration rather than the literal timeline to the Messiah. So it's really just about Israel, which, okay, like that's pretty generalized to just say, well, it's about Israel. Okay, like I agree. What about Israel is it about? And so the Christian interpretation or the Messianic Jewish interpretation is that it's the prophetic timeline predicting Jesus' coming crucifixion and the future end times. And as he had walked through, I know that there's a lot of numbers, a lot of dates, a lot of times. But again, we're answering it pretty quick and just trying to get through it. But research into this. Look up Daniel 9 timeline and how that relates to Jesus. Ask some of those questions and research it. But essentially, it's easy to just say in the Jewish perspective, it's about Israel. It's like, okay, what about Israel? And it's the timeline to Jesus.
Yeah. And I think it's really important. Again, I come back to context. So the time right now, Israel is in Babylon, suffering under the yoke of the Babylonian Empire, and all the depravity and everything that was going on at the time. And Daniel's crying out to God. Okay, time, 70 years that was prophesied by Jeremiah, who wrote years before the exile, or right at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem is when Jeremiah wrote. And so Gabriel now comes to encourage Daniel, and as Daniel as a representative of the Jewish people at the time in Babylon, that God's aware. God hears your cry. God hears your prayers. God is aware. And this is what is going to happen. People will be returned. The temple will be rebuilt. And not only that, but one greater than the temple will be coming. Not only not the temple is the place of sacrifice, the place where the people go to have their sins covered, to have their sins forgiven through the animal sacrifices. But there's one that will be coming who's going to be the ultimate sacrifice. And then we know him to be Yeshua,
right.
Jesus, right?
Right.
So this is a great encouragement. This prophecy of the 70 weeks is an incredible encouragement to, in the context, Daniel at the time, but throughout history, it would be an encouragement to those that would reflect back on it of a coming of a greater one.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
It says in verse 26, then after the 62 weeks, and sorry, can you explain just real quick again, brief, the weeks, how you calculate that?
Yeah, so the weeks are years, 7 years. Each week is 7 years.
So each week is 7 years. So if it's
Right.
saying after the 62 weeks, and 62 times 7.
Yeah,
To get to the
434.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that gets us to the time of the first century.
Okay. So every
Because-
time we
yeah.
see a week, it's 7 years.
7 years.
That's something important to keep in mind because I don't know. I feel like in the beginning, that's just me thinking out loud. Maybe it was confusing. Hopefully you've made it this far to recognize, but yeah. So it says, then after the 62 weeks, Mashiach or Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. What is that referencing and what does that mean?
Well, we would interpret that to be a reference to Yeshua's crucifixion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or someone who's going to be crucified. In other words, looking at it in the timeline, from Daniel's perspective, there's going to be one who would come that the 434 years who will be cut off. We look back and go, well, of course it was Jesus. No one else fits that description.
Right.
That would be a Messiah, anointed one. The Hebrew Mashiach means anointed one.
Yeah. And then maybe one or two more questions, but
Sure.
it says, are the last 7 years already fulfilled or are they future?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. and is debated among biblical interpreters.
Okay.
Right? Some believe that those 7 years has already happened because it says that the people of a prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay, so that happened, right? After Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection, approximately 40 years later is when this was fulfilled. We could say, right? Roman emperor comes, prince, emperor comes, destroys the temple. But some believe that that yet is to be fulfilled in a future temple, right? Because then he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, 7 years. So that many believe that 70th year, 70th week has yet to be fulfilled. And some interpret that and you call that the tribulation period, right? So in the middle of that week, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. Okay, so if we follow that understanding, interpretation, there's a 7-year period that is yet to come, where there will be some type of offerings, a temple, and that's where we get the idea of a third temple being built. Sacrifices will be brought, rebuilt in Israel. In the middle of the week, meaning after 3.5 years of that, some prince that is yet to come, will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of abominations will come one who destroys until the decreed annihilation is poured out on the one who destroys. Okay, so there's one that will come, and many interpret that to be so-called Antichrist, who will bring the destruction, but then he will be destroyed because ultimately at the end of that 7-year period is when Messiah returns.
Right.
Some would say, we who are, caught up will be caught up with him, and those that have gone on to, be with him in the heavenly realm will now be brought back, and he will establish his kingdom at that point.
So maybe in a sentence or two, if you want to give a summary of the timeline, how this points to Yeshua, and what that could mean for us today, maybe a practical something.
Sure. So in essence, Gabriel is giving Daniel a timeline. It's not all consecutive 490 years. It's going to be somewhat broken up between the 69 weeks that leads up through the time of Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection, and then a seventh year, a seventh week, or another 7-year period that is questionable when that will take place. Most interpreters believe that is a future 7-year period called the tribulation. And at the end of that 7-year period will be Yeshua's return.
Okay.
The beginning of that 7-year tribulation period, a lot of interpreters say there'll be the rapture, and that's called the pre-tribulation rapture. Some believe it's a post-tribulation rapture at the end of the 7 years when the rapture will take place, meaning being caught up in the air with Messiah will happen at the same time as his return.
Right. So
that's kind of a brief summary. There's books and books written about these various understandings and interpretations.
We're answering it, and hopefully this was under 20 minutes, but I'm not so sure.
There's a lot more that we could go into about, it's called eschatology.
Yes.
Is the study of the end times. We would say we are in those end times that started when Yeshua rose, ascended to heaven. Really is when those end times really started. And we've been in those end times since then, anticipating his return.
Right. So I know that this was, again, a lot of numbers and dates and a timeline to follow. And so I do encourage you to read Daniel 9, maybe walk through this verse by verse and pull up some different Bible commentaries to research into this, just to have it written out. I think what's helped us is we've had it written out to look at it and look at the dates and the times. So I'd encourage you to do the same thing. But essentially, this timeline puts us to date at exactly when Jesus walked on earth and exactly when he died and rose again. So it would be very coincidental to say, oh, it's just about Israel. Yeah, I know it is. And it's about the Messiah in
Yeah.
Israel. So
Yeah, and then just one last thing I was going to mention, and that is that for Jewish people do not yet, or do not believe that the Messiah has yet come. Yet we can look at this in the Hebrew Scriptures, the book of Daniel, prophesied that the Messiah would be cut off after the 62 weeks or the 484 years. It's hard to rectify then and say, well, he hasn't come yet, when it's clear that he already came
Right.
and was cut off.
right. That's
So
a good
how
point.
do you reconcile those two?
Yeah.
So
We hope that this was an encouragement to you in your walk with God, and that you could research this and comment down below your thoughts, your questions. If you need something maybe re-explained or worded different, we don't always know who we're speaking to on the other end of this that we've spoken about in other videos. So if it's hard to understand or you have questions, maybe more questions than answers, we just want to walk alongside of you as best we can through the screen. So comment, like, subscribe, share, and let us know your thoughts. We will see you next week, and talk to you soon. Bye.